Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator for this evening, Director for the Center, Jason Sorens, who has his doctorate in political science from Yale University in 2003. And he will now introduce our panelists for this evening. Thank you and welcome everybody.
Thank you, Max. So the topic for tonight is building the cities of the future, more markets or more regulation. And we've got a diversity of viewpoints on offer tonight. And I just wanted to let everyone know a little bit about how this is going to work before we start the conversation. So we're going to have some moderated panel discussion to start with. And as an attendee, you may also ask questions at any time. There's a Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please use that rather than the chat function in order to ask questions of the panelists. And now I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. First, we have Edward Glaser. Edward Glaser is the Fred and Eleanor Glint Professor of Economics in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard University, where he has taught since 1992. He regularly teaches microeconomics theory and occasionally urban and public economics. He has served as director of the Taubman Center for State and Local Government and director of the Rappaport Institute for Greater Boston. He has published dozens of papers on cities' economic growth, law, and economics. In particular, his work is focused on the determinants of city growth and the role of cities as centers of idea transmission. He received his PhD from the University of Chicago in 1992. Emily Hamilton is a research fellow and director of the Urbanity Project at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Her research focuses on urban economics and land use policy. Her writing has appeared in USA Today, the Los Angeles Times, and the Washington Post. Hamilton earned her PhD in economics from George Mason University. Alain Berthaud is an urbanist and senior research scholar at the NYU Moran Institute and NYU Stern Urbanization Project. Prior to 1999, he was a principal urban planner at the World Bank, where he advised local and national governments on urban development policies, mostly in China, Central and Eastern Europe, India, Mexico, Russia, and South Africa. Berthaud worked as resident urban planner in cities such as Bangkok, San Salvador, Sanaa, New York, Tlemcen, Chandigarh, and Paris. His most recent book is Order Without Design: How Markets Shape Cities, from the MIT Press. Alain Berthaud graduated as an architect DPLG from the École Nationale Supérieure des Beaux-Arts in Paris, France. Gerrit Jan Knop is Professor of Urban Studies and Planning, Executive Director of the National Center for Smart Growth Research at the University of Maryland. Knop's research interests include the interactions between housing markets and policy, the economics and politics of land use planning, the efficiency of economic development instruments, and the impacts of environmental policy. On these subjects, Knop has authored or co-authored over 65 articles in peer-reviewed journals and co-authored or co-edited 9 books. He currently serves on the State of Maryland Smart Growth Subcabinet, Sustainable Growth Commission, Governor's Scientific Advisory Panel, and the Mitigation and Science Work Groups of the Climate Commission. Thank you and welcome to all of our panelists. And now let's start the conversation. The first question I'd like to ask of all of our panelists for this evening, we're talking about building the cities of the future. So it occurs to me that thinking about whether we need more markets or more regulation, we need to think about what really is a city for and what makes a city flourish. So I'd like to pose that question to all of our panelists and let them have their say on that.
You should direct to someone first, Jason. You should tell who you want to go first.
All right, well, let's start with you, Ed.
All right. So economists think about cities as the absence of physical space between people. Cities at their heart are density, proximity, closeness. They are special, they are important because they enable human beings to collaborate with one another. They enable those collaborative chains of creativity that have been powering humanity's greatest hits since Socrates and Plato bickered on an Athenian street corner. They can be places of tremendous inequality. After all, it was Plato who wrote that any city, no matter how small, is in reality two cities, one a city of the rich and the other a city of the poor. And that can make them places of sort of startling pain. But on the other hand, cities should never apologize for being relatively pleasant places to be rich and less painful places to be poor, because they ultimately attract rich and poor people. The big challenge for our cities going forward is to make sure that they are places of opportunity, so that they attract poor people, but they then provide those ladders for turning poverty into prosperity, which is ultimately one of the most important functions of cities. But that's only part of the story, which is also about cultural creativity, artistic creativity, democratic governance, and the things that happen when human beings become more than we are on our own by being able to work together collaboratively in an urban area.
Emily, I'll go to you next.
Thanks, Jason, and thanks a lot for including me. I'm thrilled to be here on this panel with others whose work has really shaped my own view of cities and urban governance. In particular, Ed and Alain's work on cities as labor markets, I think is really key to understanding cities as the place where people can put their skills to their highest valued use. And beyond labor markets, of course, cities also offer opportunities for collaboration in civic and social investments, and for all different types of people to come into spontaneous contact with a huge diversity of other types of people. To your big picture question about more markets or more regulation, I think that a huge portion of government activity recently in urban areas has focused on directing what can be done on privately held land, which has contributed to housing supply shortages and high housing prices when strict limits are set on housing. But there's also a very important need for localities to plan for growth on the public sector side, making the investments in infrastructure, in schools, and public services that will allow cities to grow and be the centers of opportunity that we all want to see them be.
Thanks, Emily. Garrett, I'll go to you next.
Sure. Well, it's awfully hard to follow Ed and Emily after what they had to say. I believe most of us on the panel, if not all of us on the panel, have backgrounds in economics. So that has been emphasized. I just want to add, and Ed has mentioned this to some extent too, that cities are also the central point of culture, of art, of theater, of dance, of religion, of love, and in most cases, in more normal times, health. So cities are not only economic engines, but they're engines for much of else, the other things that we do as a society as well.
Thanks, Garrett. And Alain.
Thanks for inviting me. I would like to first argue a little about the title of this talk, more markets or more regulations. I don't think it's either or. Markets are always there, whether we like them or not. And it's just a question of what is the effect of regulation on markets? How do they play with each other? And whether the good intention of regulations, sometime where they are tested on market, give the opposite of what they were intended. So I don't think it's a question of more market or more regulation, frankly. It's a question of testing the validity of regulation over time. We cannot develop cities in laboratories, so we have to test in real time things. And that's why monitoring is so important. And again, we can anticipate what will be the market reaction to some regulations, especially when they are repeated, like say rent control or something like that. But other regulations are more subtle and we don't know. So the essential is to monitor really what is happening, and as soon as we see that something is failing, to change it. There is no there is no excuse for continuing doing things that we know do not work. Now, I would like also to change a bit the subject on the question of cities which are growing and cities which are not growing. Increasingly now, we will see in Europe, we see in Japan, we start seeing in Korea, South Korea, cities which are not growing, which are even losing population. Practically in Japan now, the majority of cities of more than 500,000 are losing population, with there are only about 5 or 6 cities which are increasing population. So I don't think we know how to manage cities which are losing population. And maybe it's something we should face. It raises, of course, the question of immigration, how immigration should be handled. But I think this is a problem we should increasingly address. To me, of course, and I've been used to that because of my age, the main problem of cities were growing population. And the faster the population was growing, the more challenging it was to develop the infrastructure, to develop the structure. But I think that increasingly we have to address this problem of, and does it mean if a city loses population, does it mean that it is unsuccessful? So far, I will say yes, but maybe I'm wrong.
Garrett, let me ask you about that a little more. Drill down on what distinguishes flourishing from stagnant cities. We know that some cities are growing or at least flourishing economically, and others are stagnating. What causes, big picture, what causes some cities to flourish and others to stagnate?
I'm sorry.
Sorry, I was directing that to Garrett. You're muted, Garrett.
I said that's a hard question. I was hoping you'd give the hard ones to my colleagues on this distinguished panel. Well, we've described some of the things that a city, some of the purposes that a city serves, right? Economic productivity, creativity, culture, health, etc. A city thrives, I believe, when it moves up or when it increases in any of those measures. What causes that is a complicated question, as Elaine has referred to. Certainly demographics has something to do with it. Certainly technology and innovation has a lot to do with it. And proximity, I think, to economic engines. So the questions about, cities, small cities, large cities. Small cities tend to do well when they are in the proximity of large cities. Right? So there are still economies of scale that are being unexploited. They can be exploited in different ways. But for the most part, I think we know that in this day and age that we need the economic engine of a large city to spill over and help the small cities survive as well.
Are we moving to a future in which cities continue to agglomerate? We get bigger and bigger cities. People continue to move from the countryside into the cities. And small cities, to the extent that they persist, are merely kind of an adjunct of larger cities.
No, look, there are plenty of successful mid-sized and small-sized cities. And I just want to, put my own gloss on what both Garrett and Ellen said. So it's important when you think about urban success to differentiate between the diagnostics, the signs that the city is doing well or poorly, which are primarily, is this city growing in population or employment? Are the city's incomes high? Are prices high? All of those are actually diagnostics that something is going on that's good. None of those are causes. Right. And so when city mayors try to pursue this will-o'-the-wisp of rising population for its own sake, that's a mistake. Right. The thing is to focus on the underlying sources of city health, which are ultimately about some combination of the quality of life and the quality of economic output. It's some combination of those two things. Now, over the broad arc of the 20th century, the variable that predicts metropolitan area growth above all is January temperature, which, partially reflects the relatively pro-business policies south of the Mason-Dixon line. It partially reflects the ease with which you can mass produce housing in cities like Atlanta, Dallas, Houston, and Phoenix, each of which produced 1 million new homes between 2000 and 2010. But let's face it, it also reflects a fondness of America for warmer winters. And I should say, as a New Englander, it shows a terrible lack of character. But I'm not gonna argue about that right now. Now, in terms of the economic drivers that you can do something about, it's about smart people small firms and connections to the outside world. It's about skilled people, skilled entrepreneurs who are starting new businesses, who are able to sort of use the connections to each other that cities enable. And that can go on in smaller cities or larger cities. There's no reason why Manchester can't be, and can continue to be a viable, incredibly successful city by leveraging its skills. And that's very much the story of Manchester, is one in which you have a city that, like all of the cities along the Merrimack, is tied down by textiles, right? It's one of the sort of great textile producing cities in the US. It is a city like all of our former New England textile cities, whether it's Lowell or Lawrence, that is hammered by deindustrialization, hammered by the move to Sunbelt cities. And yet, sometime after the 1970s, anchored by human capital, anchored by skills, Manchester comes back. And that's in some sense the story behind this. And then the question is, when hit with this rising demand for the beautiful countryside and for the economic resurgence fueled by skilled entrepreneurship, will Manchester, will New Hampshire build enough homes that it remains affordable?
So Emily touched on this a little bit, but I'm interested to hear what she and others might say about this question. In general, what is the United States doing well and doing poorly when it comes to urban policy? What's right or wrong with the American city in general?
The U.S. has lots of cities that have done a fantastic job of accommodating growing populations, both from within the U.S. and in terms of international immigration. Houston is one of my favorite cities to study and learn about because they're so well known for allowing lots of outward growth and new suburban development. But more recently, they've implemented minimum lot size reforms that allow infill development in closer in neighborhoods and have allowed older single-family homes to be replaced by more newer homes, leading to densification and more opportunities for people to live in some of the city's most desirable neighborhoods. So I'd highly recommend for city lovers to spend some time on Houston Google Street View, checking out the change in some of their neighborhoods.
And so both Ed and Emily have mentioned that some places are building more homes than others, and partly that's a result of demand, probably, but some of it may have something to do with supply. So why are some places building more homes than others? What are the economic consequences of that? Really for anyone.
Well, I think that what is a little disturbing is that there is a geographical pattern of area in the US which are building more homes and others which are not. And so there is obviously something cultural about it. My guess is that the successful cities on the coast are in a certain way rather self-satisfied and are looking for the status quo. They become, in fact, they are considered liberal politically, but very conservative when it comes to cities. And they want just to maintain what is there. There's always in cities this dichotomy between change, which makes a life of city, and people who are quite happy the way it is and resist change. That's why you find rather, what I would call silly regulations who receive a lot of support. In fact, silly regulations are not necessarily invented by crazy planners. There is a constituency for silly regulations. And I think that this is the difference. There could be also a topographical, aspect. It's certain that the south of the United States have more flat land, and it's probably easier to develop than certainly San Francisco Bay or New York or Boston. That's quite something. But I think that there is a conservatism, a keeping what is there, which prevent city from developing. And I think in the long run, it's a losing proposal because cities need to transform themselves to adjust to external shock, even if for instance, the COVID-19 will make any change. If it makes any change, it will require a lot of change in land use regulation and to adjust to whatever the people do by voting with their feet and firms do by voting with their feet.
Now, New Hampshire is one of those places actually that, even though it doesn't really have a large metropolitan area, it sort of abuts the Boston metropolitan area. And I think the Census Bureau even says it goes into New Hampshire to a small extent. We are one of the more expensive housing markets in the country. The Bureau of Economic Analysis says that New Hampshire is the 8th most costly state to live in. And by at least one measure of regulations on building new homes, New Hampshire is the 4th strictest state in the country for building new homes. So what kinds of solutions would you advocate for a state like New Hampshire that's facing costly housing, despite high household incomes? Population's also not growing as much as it used to. People aren't flocking to the state as much as they used to. And there's a big homeless problem, certainly in Manchester, but also to some extent in Nashua and Portsmouth. So what would be some sorts of solutions for states like New Hampshire, for cities like Manchester?
Well, there's no repealing the laws of supply and demand, Jason. I mean, the problem is not a lack of demand for Manchester. I mean, the NAR, the National Association of Realtors numbers give your prices up to $320,000 for the average sales price. The Federal Housing Finance Agency shows a 47% nominal increase in prices over the past 5 years for the state of New Hampshire, right? Obviously, demand is robust. And yet, the state is building much less than it was at its heyday. I mean, building, 4,000 new units a year on average, something like that over the past 5 years, right? That's really a very small number for a state with 500,000 housing units, households as a whole. That's about a 1% number, which is barely at a replacement rate. You can't add population if you don't build homes. And if there's a robust demand that collides into fixed supply, this is what you get. You get rising prices, you get stagnant population, you get lower income, middle income people increasingly priced out. You probably have less of a homeless problem than you would if your winters were a little milder. But there's no question that there are trade-offs on this. Now, there's a constituency, as was mentioned, for restricting housing supply. And I think I agree very strongly with Alain's diagnosis. I think I would broaden it beyond, not in my backyardism, beyond just opposition to new building, as an America which in more or less my lifetime has become much more protective of insiders, right? That we have, whether or not in business regulations or in housing regulations or in our federal government, which is a pension system with an army, right? Over and over again, we have set up a system in which we protect I speak as one on the wrong side of 50, right? They protect people like me against people like Emily, right? That's what we're doing on this. And it's a very sad thing to see in the country as a whole. Now, I think I should turn it over to Garrett or Alain to talk about what actually, on the micro level we want to do in terms of changing planning, because the right answer isn't nothing. I am strongly in favor of more regulations when it comes to requiring people to connect to sewer lines in sub-Saharan Africa. There are lots of places in which, I think more regulation is better. We live in a world of a pandemic, in which case it would be crazy to think that all regulations are a mistake. But that being said, not all regulations are wise either. And I agree with Alain that you see plenty of silly regulations throughout the world. And you have to make it easier to build if you're going to make it possible for younger people to find their future in New Hampshire and in the US.
So I think I'm on this panel to be the apologist for regulation. A role I will play, even though I wouldn't disagree with anything that either Ed or Elaine or Emily have said. You can't repeal the law of supply and demand. I'm trained as an economist myself, and clearly there's a lot of rent seeking, and the way I describe it, I think most succinctly is, the last one in always wants to close the door behind them, which captures a bit of what Ed says. That said, and we can maybe get into the details of this later on, but I still favor growth boundaries. I favor inclusionary zoning. Right? I favor comprehensive planning because I think these all have important roles to play. We think about regulations as being a bad thing, and quite clearly they can be a bad thing. Right? But why do we have regulations for reasons other than rent seeking? And we have them, economists tend to talk about, externalities and providing public goods. And we know there's been tons of research, often using hedonic price estimation, which looks at the effects on housing and land prices of regulations, and find that yes, regulations do have these potentially adverse impacts. But there's this whole other body of work by economists and others that show that housing and land prices are also affected by proximity to factories, to landfills, to water bodies, to parks and open space, to transit stations, to highways, to freedom, to freeways, to commercial uses. Yes, these things all do affect land values and thereby affect the quality of life. Furthermore, the public goods that we all care about, schools, parks, libraries, universities, water and sewer capacities, these also matter, right? Sometimes in direct proximity or sometimes within the same jurisdiction. So there is a huge role for the public sector to play. And some of that can be played through pricing and impact fees and taxes and so forth, but some of that continues to be necessary to impose regulations. That's my speech.
Thanks, Garrett. Well, let's maybe mix it up on that a little bit. I know we have some attendees who are professionals in this space, so I think this could be a fruitful conversation. What about inclusionary zoning and urban growth boundaries? What's the smartest case for these? What's the smartest case against them?
I'll chime in here if no one else is going to. Elaine, were you going to jump in here? Go ahead.
Go ahead, Gary. Sorry.
Garrett, I think
You're muted.
Yep, sorry. I think I'll chime in here quickly. I think the most important benefit of inclusionary zoning is the distributional impact of affordable housing is getting it into a variety of communities and not concentrated in one place. I think it has an effect on the supply. The supply effect tends to be relatively small. And yes, it is a tax on other forms of housing, but finding a mechanism for getting affordable housing, housing for low-income people in higher opportunity areas, as Ed referred to earlier, I think inclusionary zoning has an important role to play. On urban growth boundaries, I don't believe in fixed growth boundaries, but I do believe growth boundaries are an important mechanism for timing the rate of growth, making sure that that timing is consistent with the provision of infrastructure. So as a tool for that timing and that phasing of growth, I think they're very important and useful tools.
Yeah, I have a slightly different opinion on that, but tomorrow I will discuss inclusionary zoning in New York and just a case study. I don't pretend to cover the subject entirely. My take on it is that yes, it makes income, but which is a good thing. But on the other hand, it has a very high cost in terms of the incentive which are given to developers, which are not very transparent. One of them is a bonus on floor ratio. Now the floor ratio, if the planners use it or the city use it as a bonus in order to generate low-cost housing, they have a big interest in keeping it low everywhere to keep the value very high. And therefore, everybody is really paying a very high price. You basically now, the city of New York has a monopoly on the supply of any additional floor space. And because they use this monopoly to negotiate with developers, they have an interest, to, as any monopolist, to release very wisely the amount of floor space and release them only for their projects. So I think it has a very detrimental effect. Although the people who win the lottery, and this is also my problem with inclusionary zoning, is that usually there is a lottery of about 100,000 people who apply for about 100 apartments. And this has been like that since the beginning. So I don't believe that there is a supply system which should be based on a lottery when the odds are so bad.
So 3 points on inclusionary zoning. I think, first of all, I have some sympathy for what Garrett said about wanting to make it possible to have middle income housing in the midst of rich areas. And I think one of the problems that the defenders of new construction in cities like New York, like myself, have is that many of the new apartments tend to be apartments for billionaires. And that's a product of how an evolution of 50 years of zoning has worked out. But certainly I'm in favor of fast tracking apartments for middle income New Yorkers or for middle income New Hampshireites. And I don't think it's a terrible thing at all if, you allow a builder to add a few extra stories in exchange for producing some middle income housing. I don't think that's a terrible thing at all. I guess on some level, I would rather that we just make it easier to build inexpensive housing in high value areas and let the market deliver what it delivers. But if that really is not about to happen, I think we should be open to this. I don't think this is one of the great villains in the world. I do, though, want to highlight something Alain said, which is the thing that feels to me almost like the largest worry of the, and I think maybe we can call it the affordable housing trap, which is that real affordability means that any young person, anyone who comes to Manchester can find an apartment that they want to rent, that they can live in for, I don't know, $800 a month, $1,000 a month. They don't need to win a lottery. They just come, they find it, it's there. That's actually what real affordability looks like. It's not that 3 people won a lottery out of 100,000 people and happened to get these things. And the problem is that these 3 affordable units allow the politicians to line up and say, look at me. I supported affordable housing. I got these 3 units. You literally, the front page of my hometown paper 10 years ago so had all of the local notables lined up to celebrate the opening of exactly 1 affordable housing unit. Exactly 1, which was supposed to be a triumph for affordable housing in suburban Boston, right? This is something that is sort of deeply problematic. And we really do at least have to remember that real affordability isn't a few fit-in units. It's where everyone who wants to find a space can find it. I think that really only happens with sort of larger scale reform that makes it easier for market developers to actually build smaller units, centrally located, hopefully in places that are reasonably close to work.
Well, we've talked, oh, go ahead, Garrett.
I just wanted to follow up on that. What is that policy? If you agree that, inclusionary zoning isn't ideal and there must be a better way, can you describe that better way and how we get to the politics of that result?
So there's a line from my late lamented colleague, Marty Feldstein, which is, you don't necessarily need to know where you want to end up, but only the direction that you want to head in on policy debates. And I often feel that way around land use controls, that I don't actually need to know whether or not, how far towards Houston, Boston's going to end up. So I actually share Emily's fondness for Houston, but when I talk to my fellow Bostonians, I don't need to advocate that we're going to go all in that direction. But all I know is that I want to move somewhat in that role. I want to make it somewhat easier to build. I want to make it faster. I think most of the time what I want is a bunch of areas with fairly permissive as-of-right zoning. And I want to make sure that there are areas where developers can build with a fair amount of clarity about what they can put in. I'm all right if that's primarily centrally located. I'm all right if that's primarily brownfields, but we need to create enough space in these high demand areas so you can deliver housing quickly and easily. And I think that's the direction that I would tend to head in. And just the clarity and the predictability is really central. I think in some sense, the lowest hanging fruit that surely none of us are in favor of an uncertain process that lasts a decade. Whatever we think is the right level of inclusionary or low density or whatever, a process that says that like, you've got to start this thing of having 10 years of meetings with no idea of when it'll end up, that cannot possibly be a sensible way to regulate anything.
And just quick response. And the other extreme is none of us wants to create places where you can just immediately come in and build without any any government regulations or any public input as well, right? That's the other extreme is just as unacceptable.
I wasn't disagreeing, right? So just to be clear, what I was saying was as of right zoning, which means we have a plan, right? The plan is down there, and then the plan goes, you build within the plan. So the plan may be a simple grid like the one Alan wants. The plan may be something much more regulated as you want. But we have the plan. We don't then have, once the plan is there, we don't have a 10-year uncertain process after the plan.
All right, well, I have a feeling we could dig much more into this housing issue, but I do want to leave some time for Q&A. So I wanted to ask a question about urban transportation. Do markets have a role in getting people from home to office and back? Is there more that cities could do here to make urban transportation more rational? Should we let the market decide the mix of mass transit versus other forms of transportation? Should we subsidize mass transit? New Hampshire has considered having some kind of commuter rail built to connect to Boston, certainly to Nashua, maybe all the way to Manchester or even Concord, according to some proposals. Is that a obviously we don't have time for a full cost-benefit analysis here on this panel, but in general, those good ideas.
So Jason, there's an old joke that 40 years of transportation economics at Harvard can be boiled down to 4 words: bus good, train bad. Okay, and whatever you think you want to do for public transportation in density levels like New Hampshire, you can do it with a bus. You can rent the buses, you can lease the buses, you can see how much demand shows up with the buses. You can subsidize the buses if you want. It's not going to be that much money. There is a potential argument for subsidizing buses for poorer residents. There's a whole extra layer of COVID in public transportation, but trains are incredibly expensive, incredibly inflexible. And quite honestly, in a world in which we're looking at a future of autonomous vehicles, they feel like a 19th century technology being grafted into a 21st century, whereas buses are flexible and there's nothing you can do with a train that you can't do with a bus on a dedicated lane. An autonomous bus running 150 miles per hour, why not? Why commit yourself to something that is fixed and is antiquated?
Could I add something here? You see, the government, the municipal government, is the owner of the right-of-ways. And I think that their job on transport is to manage those right-of-ways. Rather than, spend a lot of time on the size of kitchen or bathrooms, I think that it's much better than they really look at what they control and what they own, literally, and allocate or even multiply those areas by, to different mode of transport. And I believe too that probably we are going toward for the first time in 100 years, a revolution in urban transport because of complementary technology. And I will see a mix actually. Either, now we have either you have private transport, motorcycle or, or cars, or you have transit. And I think that the future will be a mix of the two in the same trip. And that technology will make it really possible. But again, this is a supposition.
Can I speak? Go ahead, Emily. I spoke.
Oh, I was just going to add that one point of low-hanging fruit in terms of right-of-way management is perhaps congestion pricing in places where commuters have to spend huge amounts of time in their cars and pay for their commute with their time, rather than relying on congestion pricing as some cities like London or Singapore have done to maintain free-flowing traffic that drivers pay for with money rather than time, and creates incentives for carpooling or making trips at non-peak hours in order to get more value out of those public rights of way.
All right, thanks, Emily and all the panelists. Let's move to Q&A now. We have a number of interesting questions here. And I'm going to pick out a few of them that I think maybe represent the spirit of all of them. There are quite a few that we won't be able to get to. Here's an interesting kind of in the weeds question. What are the views of the speakers on land value capture in infrastructure projects?
Land value capture, good.
So I think my favorite model for mass transportation is Hong Kong's MTR, where they pay for the trains, and trains are more plausible in Hong Kong than they are in Manchester, New Hampshire. They pay for the trains by building skyscrapers on top of the trains. So they run a system, it makes money, and they make it by building tall on top of rail stops. Perfectly reasonable model. Land value capture is just an attempt to make that work here. Of course, it doesn't work as well as the Hong Kong model usually, but it's the basic idea is sound of trying to capture the value created by all sorts of urban investments.
So I would amend Ed's summary of buses good, trains bad, of buses good, trains bad, unless they finance infrastructure with land value capture.
Fair enough. And so for our attendees, land value capture involves capturing that additional taxing away, for instance, the additional value of the land created by an infrastructure project. So here's an interesting question. Do you have any thoughts on the incorporation of the middle housing options and the ability to better include social and environmental justice into the planning process? How can we vision the building of cities or reworking cities for a better future for all with these concepts in mind? Does this prompt more or less regulation? So about middle housing options and including social environmental justice in the planning process.
Emily, you want to speak?
Go ahead, Garrett, thanks.
So middle income housing is the rage these days of conversations among planners. I do think it's an area where more work could be done. There are a couple of strategies you could follow. One is to try to loosen the restrictions of single family zoning. There are some jurisdictions that are going in that direction now, which I think will be very interesting to follow. There are also ways of using inclusionary zoning or requirements from a state level of government to local levels of governments that they must provide capacity for middle income housing. And I think both of those are interesting strategies, and we'll wait to see if they work.
Agreed. The area of land use reform that I'm most optimistic about right now is states stepping in to set some limits on the extent to which localities can block housing development. And many of those efforts have been focused on missing middle housing forms and loosening single family exclusive zoning. When land use decisions are made at a hyper local level, the concerns of people who don't want to see any change tend to be weighted more than the broadly dispersed benefits of new housing that will accrue to people who we don't even know who they are yet. So I think states have an important role to step in to increase property rights for building and set some limits on zoning restrictions.
Emily couldn't be more right on this. In fact, the only way we get towards land use reform that makes sense is from state governments. It'll never happen by jawboning wealthy suburbs and getting them to change on their own. And the federal government has almost no role to play, just by the basis of the Constitution, these local matters. It's really an issue of state governments. And her analysis was perfect.
And from some quick looking that I did, it appears as New Hampshire has moved a bit in that direction with its smart growth legislation. Is that right, Jason? You want to weigh in here?
Yeah, New Hampshire's done a little bit to preempt local zoning, only through, I mean, it's very light touch stuff, like setting up a statewide housing appeals board is the most recent move, which might be a first in the nation move, whereby there will now be an alternative to the courts for property owners to appeal the land use decisions of local governments that they believe are illegal. So for instance, if the local government is illegally, holding up a permit or requiring unnecessary reviews, you can now appeal to this housing appeals board rather than the court system. And that appeals board is in turn appointed by the Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court. So kind of an interesting solution, but it doesn't go as far as saying these local land use restrictions are forbidden and preempted.
I mean, there are basically two models, right? One of which is sort of Massachusetts Chapter 40B model, which is you basically give developers an end run around local land use zoning to a state process. Or you do a bribery model. Sorry, that's a word economists think is fine, but it's not generally thought to be okay. You use an incentive model where there are Massachusetts chapters 40R and 40S, where you provide penalties for not building middle income housing or lower income housing, or rewards for building more middle income, or either way are feasible. Generally, the 40B route tends to be far less, far more confrontational, far less popular, far more difficult to get through. The 40R and 40S route, you really have to have pretty strong incentives if anything's going to happen. The one thing I think that is sort of attractive is, in principle, you can basically end up getting some of the wealthier localities to, end up supporting housing in more middle income areas, and maybe even indirectly subsidizing the schools in those areas. And that's maybe not the worst outcome.
I should say the one way in which state government recently did preempt local zoning in New Hampshire, and some other states are also looking into this now, is requiring towns to allow attached accessory dwelling units, so in-law apartments. So towns are forbidden from forbidding those. An interesting move. Here's another question. What are the panelists' views on the impact of Opportunity Zone funds on communities? This is a federal program. Is the money raised from these tax advantage investments showing any signs of helping struggling neighborhoods and regions?
No impact on prices. In fact, I have a paper on this, which just incorporated the latest 2019 data. You try and compare these with actual treated areas, you get, comparable areas, you get nothing. You do get, like, some of the data that you've seen from Zillow studies seem to show positive effects, but none of those are repeat sales indices, meaning that what happens is the prices appear to go up because you see higher end properties transact. If you compare apples to apples, you see absolutely no impact of these things on prices.
Okay. Here's another question. What does smart growth mean nowadays, considering climate change, pandemics, and the enormous economic crisis that is threatening millions to be evicted from their homes?
I suppose I better weigh in on this one. It's a damn good question. I mean, we know what smart growth means in terms of, promoting mixed land uses, high density, transit-oriented development, more vibrant urban places. I think that's relatively consistent with the strategy to try to mitigate climate change. I'm not sure what it means in the middle of a pandemic.
Do any of you have thoughts on how the pandemic affects housing policy at all? Is there any implication, for municipalities here?
Well, it's an incredible shock to urban density. It's an incredible shock to urbanization. In some sense, the policy of social distancing is a radical de-urbanization of our world. Even under the sort of most optimistic scenario, I think this has implications for cities and real estate for several years at the very least. I mean, there is a dire scenario, which is that the pandemic lasts for years and then we get a new pandemic within the next 10 years. And in that case, sort of face-to-face contact becomes terrifying for a very long period. I think that is such a terrible outcome for the American economy, for the world economy, for the 32 million American workers who labor in leisure, hospitality, and retail trade, that we cannot possibly let that happen, that we will make investments to make sure that this never happens again. But even so, this will be a shock. Probably not as bad as the 1970s, right? So Alain and I both have strong memories of New York in the 1970s, and it probably won't be like that. But even so, right, you're going to see a drop in demand for commercial real estate. We've recently done a series of polls of small business owners, and more than 40% of firms say that 40% or more of the workers that have switched to remote will stay remote, right? That doesn't mean that, office towers in San Francisco or Boston will remain empty. They will be, replaced by other activities, but prices will fall. Right? And in some cases, you're going to need to see commercial space replaced with residential space. I think demand for city living will be more robust than city working. You probably will see a reshuffling of older, well-established firms, which are comfortable letting their workers go off, with newer firms where they really want the sort of bringing new employees, the ability to sort of inspire and connect at high densities. So you're going to see a little bit of a change. You're certainly going to see a challenge for local revenues that come from declining tax revenues, declining property tax revenues. So you'll probably see a bit of the pressure on affordability come off in the next couple of years. The danger that I have for this conversation, there are a whole set of dangers around this, but the danger that I have for this conversation is, it felt to me like in 2006, we were just getting going on getting some reform, and then all of a sudden you get this crash, and then nobody wants to talk about how to promote affordable housing anymore. And, it feels like we're going to have some correction now, and then all of a sudden, why are you talking about affordability? We've got to save the housing market again and do something like this. So the critical thing that I beg everyone here who cares about housing and housing policy is, like, stay focused on the longer term. Right? Yes, we're going to have to deal with this crisis, and the crisis is terrible. But when it comes to sort of land use reform, nothing happens quickly. We have to plan for the long term. We need to have policies that enable states like New Hampshire to grow in a way that is sane and sensible and inclusive. And, we need to fight for that, not just for today, but for years to come.
I think that one of the impact I see is more on the viability of the finance of large cities. I'm afraid of that the short-term effect will be that very large city will be broke, and they will reduce services to the point. And the highest the density, the more services has to be perfect, to be livable. And so I'm very concerned about that. In a way, I share the view with Ed that there will be movement of people. Some people will move to the suburbs or somewhere, or to Montana, maybe, I don't know. But they will be immediately replaced. The housing stock is still there. The office building is still there. There will be people who will see opportunity. I'm not worried too much about that. I'm more worried about, in the short term, to see the service in a city deteriorating because the cities get broke. And unless this is, so that will be, again, we get back to New York during the 70s, but it could be even worse than that.
We have time for one last question, and I'm going to include this one because it reflects the kind of concern I hear a lot. How do you encourage affordable housing either with inclusionary zoning or without it when the cost of construction is so high that only high-end housing seems cost-effective? This sort of is like a skeptic that deregulating is going to help because the cost of construction might still be high.
So it's really not that expensive to build basic housing in this country. It's not like the cost of wood is so much different in New Hampshire than it is in Houston. And yet it's pretty easy to build and pretty easy to build cheaply. Part of the difference is that what you think of as the cost of building reflects the cost after you have regulation, which is partially meaning that you have basically in places like Boston or Manchester, you have every building is bespoke. Every building is one building that needs to get fit inside the rules, right? That's a very expensive way to build. End up having prices like $250, $300 a square foot, maybe more on these things as opposed to $90, $100 a square foot, which would be a mass-produced in Houston kind of number. So you can produce housing cheaply, but it needs to be done in a different way than we've been thinking about it for a while. And we need to envision ways in which we are going to allow builders to actually lay down significant numbers of units at one time in a way that is cost effective, rather than expecting every builder to go unit by unit and think that that's like asking, saying, how are we going to get cheap clothes for the developing world? And we're thinking the only way we have making clothes is going to Savile Row and having tailors do them. That's basically what we're asking for on this, and that's not going to happen.
All right, and that's, I'm afraid that we've run out of time, and in the interest of our attendees, so we're going to leave it there. So a big thanks to all of our panelists and to our attendees. Take care.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. I enjoyed it.
Thank you, Gary.
Yes, that was fun. Thank you. Hi, Gary. we haven't seen each other since, I think the last time we saw each other was in Panama about 25 years ago or something like that.
That's right. You look exactly the same, Alain.
Really? Well, just a year ago, I was not looking like that, I tell you.
Good to see you, though.
Yeah, same here. Hi, Emily.
Hi, Lynn. Great to see you.
See you, Alain.
I'm just trying to remove the remaining attendees so we can chat more freely if anyone wants to.
Bill Fischel was on the call, which is fantastic.
Yes, he's a participant in the research workshop that we have going on tomorrow. So it's
good.
great. Yeah. He has a paper provocatively titled "Is Zoning Racist?" So I haven't read it yet, so I'm looking forward to it.
It's not a new subject.
No, it's not.
No.
All right, and that does it for the attendees. So again, my personal thanks to all of you. I think this was a great conversation. Obviously, we could have gone a lot longer and dug into a lot of these topics much more deeply, but I think this was really educational for our attendees. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I want to chip in and say I thought it was excellent. It was stimulating, provocative. I think you did a great job of connecting it to the New Hampshire community, which I think people appreciated very much. And I, for one, hope we can do something like this again, if you'd be willing.
The next time,
Maybe even live, maybe even in person sometime in the future.
Yeah, indeed.
Yes, that would be nice. Yes, yes.
Yeah, we had something awesome planned with an hors d'oeuvres and cocktail reception and all of that, but not this time.
We'll look for it next year.
Yes.
That's right.
Look forward to it.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Good
Thank
night.
you.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
Bye, thanks.
Bye.